What is the use of a login form which does not accept a password? Let's try and add a password to this in this step. Let's do it a little quickly. So what we want is, this is name, and we want to have a password field as well. So I'll say password, and I would need to create a text field to accept the password. In HTML5 there is a type called password, so I'll use that type password. And I'll also give the name as password because the name of this particular field is also password. So its type is password because when I type something in a password field, it will not be visible. And the name which I'm giving to it is also password. So now I have a password in here. As a first step, let's actually just display the password. Ideally, this should not be done because, why do you want to display a password on a screen? So not really good thing to do, but just to say that we are able to pick it up, let's add it to the welcome.jsp as well. Welcome, and your password is $. So there you go. Now this is so simple to add in a field. Now if I go and refresh the screen, login.do, you see a name and a password, and I type in name as in 28 minutes, and I'll say some password and press login. Firefox asks me if I want to save my password. I'll say no, and the message which I get back is welcome in 28 minutes, and your password is some password. Ideally, you should not do this. You will never display a password on a website, but we just wanted to make sure that we are able to get the password correctly. Now that we added in the password, let's quickly add in some validation for the password and make sure that a user is valid before he comes in. So there are two kinds of flows possible. One is a valid user, right? So there's a valid user, he logs in, and that user we would want to send him to the welcome page. So valid user with the right password, we want to send him to the welcome.jsp, or it should be able. And an invalid user, what do we do with him? Invalid user, if the ID and password is invalid, what do? We send him back to the login page, right? That's basically what we would do. We would send him back to the login page. That's the functionality that we would try and develop right now. So if it's a valid user, we'll go to welcome.jsp, and if it's an invalid user, we'll go back to login.jsp. What we would want to do is to find out if a user is valid or not. For that, I need to have a service. What I'll do is I'll create a new Java class. So I'll call it new class, and I'll say user validation service and say finish. And the user validation service will have a method. So it will accept, it's a public method, and it would return a boolean whether the user is valid or not. So it will say if a user is valid or not, and the name is user valid, and it accepts two inputs, string user and string. And now I'll have one set of user ID and password which is valid. So I'll say if user equals in 28 minutes and password dot equals dummy, return true. I'll say let's assume that this is the only set of valid user ID and password. In all other situations, we are returning a false back. This is a very simple service. Actually, this would be talking to some authentication service usually, which is in a database or which is really a authentication system to find out whether the user ID and password is fine. But here, because we are starting with web application development, we created a hard-coded simple user validation service. This validation service, it accepts if it's in 28 minutes or and dummy. If the user ID is this and dummy, then it's a valid user. And any other user for this particular system is an invalid user. So this is quite a simple validation service that we built in. Now, we would want to make use of this in the login servlet. So what we want to do in the login servlet is in the post method, I'll do a right click, refactor, and extract local variable. And I'll give it a name. I'm getting the name from the request parameter, as well as I'll get the password as well. I'll call this pass. So all we are doing is we are taking from the request and putting it to a variable. Now I'm putting it to a variable so that I can pass it to the login service method. So we have actually created a user validation service. So what I'll do is I'll create an instance of the user validation service in here. So I'll say private user validation service is equal to new user validation service. I've created now the service. I would call the service from here. Service.is user valid. I need to pass in the name and the password. What does it return? It returns if the user is valid or not. So if is user valid? If user is valid, what do we want to do? If user is valid, we want to send him to the welcome JSP. That's what we decided earlier. So if user is valid, we will send him to the welcome JSP. Else, what did we want to do? We wanted to send him back to the login. So let's go ahead and do that. All that we have done in the last few steps is we created a user validation service. The user validation service has only one set of valid user ID and password. If that's met, then it returns true. Otherwise, it returns false. And in the login servlet, we created an instance of this particular service, and we are now using this particular service to validate if a user is valid. If the user is valid, we are sending him to the welcome JSP. He has entered the correct user ID and password, so he can go to the welcome.jsp. Otherwise, we are sending him back to the login.jsp. Let's see if this particular piece of code is working. I'll take the user ID from here in 28 minutes, and also I'll take the password from here, dummy, and use it and see if it's working fine. Aha, that's good. I'm going to the welcome.jsp and I can see the welcome screen. In the welcome.jsp, I'm printing the password. I don't want to see the password anymore on the screen. So let's remove the password from the welcome.jsp. So in the welcome.jsp, I don't need the password anymore. So let's just say welcome username. So let's do a refresh and it's only printing welcome in 28 minutes. That's really good. So login.do, I type in 28 minutes. Be careful with the case because we have actually made a case sensitive thing. So be careful with the case of in 28 minutes. So you copy in 28 minutes and the password is PASS. Oops, not PASS, it's DUMMY and press login. You'd go into the welcome page. Let's now try with invalid user ID and password. So in 28 minutes and some other password, login. It comes back to the login page. So if I enter an invalid user ID and password, it takes me back to the login page. That's really good. But I would really like to see a message in here. I would want to see a message which says something is wrong. You have done something wrong. You entered an invalid credential. Something of that kind needs to be printed in here. So let's add that functionality in too. So we want to add a message. What message do we want to add? We want to add an error message. So how do we send that to the JSP? From servlet, if I want to send something to the JSP, one of the options is request. So request.set attribute, error message. What is the error message? For now, I'll just hard code it in here. Invalid credentials. We have set the attribute invalid credentials in here, but we also need to show it on the login.jsp. Let's create a paragraph P and let's show the error message in here. Oops, it's not right. $. The thing which we used is error. It's case sensitive, so be very careful with it. And also, I'll put a font color is equal to red, just to show that it's an error message. I mean, this is not really perfect HTML, but we'll work on it very soon. So font color is equal to red, error message, and the username and the password. Let's see what happens now. Login.do, I enter in 28 minutes as the name and some wrong password. Aha, there you go. Invalid credentials is coming in right now. So now I type in 28 minutes and the correct password, welcome in 28 minutes. That's perfect. So now if I enter a wrong password, invalid credentials. If I enter the right user ID and password, I'll be logging in. That's really cool. So you have actually implemented your first real login form using Post right now. In the next step, we would further enhance this functionality.